He called her lucky, the herbalist who gave everything to everyone around her. She whispered back the one thing she never meant to say out loud. What she didn't know, the traveler she'd quietly fallen for wasn't just passing through. He was a Fey prince, and he hadn't forgotten a single word she said. The string lights had been Emma's idea 3 years ago, and now nobody could imagine the harvest festival without them. They stretched from every rooftop on Main Street, looping through the old oak branches and wrapping around the wooden stalls like golden thread. By the time the sun dipped behind the Cascades, Willow Creek looked like something out of a dream, warm and glowing and impossibly small against the darkening mountains. Emma Brooks didn't have time to appreciate any of it. That jar goes on the left side. The lavender salve goes next to the calendula. No, not there, the other left. This left. Ethan held up the jar on the wrong side again, grinning. You're doing that on purpose. I genuinely don't know which left you mean. You have to admit that's a you problem. She grabbed it from him and placed it herself, and he laughed, stepping back to give her room. That laugh. She had cataloged it without meaning to over these past few months, the way it came easily, without effort, like he found the world consistently funnier than most people did. Ethan Hart had arrived in Willow Creek in early spring, introduced himself as a traveler passing through, and then simply never left. Nobody thought to question it. That was the thing about him. He fit. He helped Mrs. Calloway carry groceries without being asked. He knew the names of every plant in Emma's garden within a week. He showed up at the festival tonight as if it were obvious he would, carrying crates and setting up her booth before she'd even finished her coffee. She didn't know what to do with that. The evening moved fast the way festival evenings always did. Emma sold out of her chamomile tinctures by 7 and spent the next hour answering questions about growing calendula from people who would never actually grow calendula. Old Gerald from the far end of Maple Street stopped by to say his back had finally stopped aching, and Emma listened to the full story even though she'd heard it twice already. A young mother came asking for something to help her daughter sleep, and Emma spent 20 minutes going through options carefully, making sure the woman left with the right information and nothing she didn't need. Ethan watched all of it. He didn't hover or interrupt. He just refilled jars when they ran low, handed her things before she asked for them, and stayed out of the way when she needed space. At one point she glanced over and caught him watching her help Gerald, and something in his expression made her look away quickly. By 9 o'clock the crowd had thinned to the comfortable kind, people lingering rather than rushing, the music slower now, someone playing acoustic guitar near the fountain. Emma finished counting her remaining stock and let herself breathe for the first time all evening. You didn't have to stay this whole time, she said. Ethan was leaning against the wooden frame of the stall, looking out at the lights. I know. You could have gone and enjoyed the festival. I did enjoy it. She looked at him. He was still watching the crowd, but there was something quieter in his face than usual, something that didn't match the easy grin he normally wore. Emma. He said her name like he'd been working up to it. Can I say something strange? You say strange things all the time. This one's different. He turned to look at her then, and she noticed, not for the first time, that his eyes caught the light in a way she couldn't quite explain. Too bright. Too still. I've watched you tonight. All night. And he stopped. Tried again. Whoever marries you is going to be very, very lucky. The noise of the festival didn't go anywhere. The guitar kept playing. Someone nearby laughed at something, but Emma heard none of it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear herself say it. I was hoping it would be you. The stillness that followed lasted about 3 seconds. Ethan's expression shifted, surprise first, then something warmer and more complicated underneath, like a door opening onto a room he hadn't expected to find. He opened his mouth. She saw him deciding what to say. Then his jacket pocket lit up. Not glowed like a phone screen. Lit up, soft silver, pulsing, impossible. His hand moved to it immediately, and the light vanished. But his entire posture changed in the same instant. Whatever had been in his face a second ago was gone, replaced by something tight and urgent. I have to go. His voice was different. Controlled. What, right now? I'm sorry. He was already stepping back. Emma, he stopped himself. Looked at her once more, and for just a second that warmth was back, real and unmistakable. I'm sorry. And then he was walking away, disappearing into the thinning crowd, and the festival lights kept burning, and Emma stood very still in her empty stall holding a jar of lavender salve she didn't remember picking up. On the table beside the cash box, half hidden under a cloth, sat a small carved moon pendant she had never seen before. The portal closed behind Ethan like a held breath finally released. One moment he was standing in the shadow of a Douglas fir at the edge of Willow Creek, and the next he was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the air tasted like rain and silver and something older than any word he knew in English. The Cascade Mountains still surrounded him, but these were not the mountains humans hiked on weekends. These peaks had never appeared on any map. The city nestled between them had never been photographed, never been stumbled upon, never been anything other than exactly what it chose to be. Silver Hollow. The city rose in gentle tiers along the mountain walls, buildings carved from pale stone that caught moonlight and held it, glowing faintly even on overcast nights. Bridges of woven willow and spelled iron connected the upper districts to the lower ones. Water moved through the streets in narrow channels, always clean, always faintly luminescent. At the center of it all stood the Valen Tower, where the Fae Court had governed for longer than anyone cared to count. Ethan crossed the main bridge without stopping to appreciate any of it. His grandmother was already waiting. Queen Muriel did not pace. Pacing suggested anxiety, and Muriel had decided long ago that anxiety was a thing other people experienced. She stood at the wide window of her council chamber, hands folded, watching the city below with the particular stillness of someone who had been waiting calmly for a very long time and intended to keep doing so. She turned when Ethan entered. "You're later than I expected." The festival ran long. He kept his voice even. "What's happening?" She gestured toward the council table, where a large map had been spread and marked with small silver pins. 3 of his grandmother's advisors stood around it, none of them looking especially relaxed. Ethan recognized the locations immediately. Each pin marked a portal site, the hidden crossing points where the Fae and human worlds pressed against each other like palms laid flat on either side of a thin wall. 7 sites, said Counselor Davin, a tall Fae woman with close-cropped silver hair and the permanent expression of someone reviewing a disappointing report. 7 sites reporting fluctuations in the past 9 days. 2 of them are classified as critical. Critical meaning what exactly? Meaning the stabilizers are degrading faster than natural, where would explain. Davin touched the map near the Oregon coast. Here and here. At the current rate, we're looking at partial breaches within the month. Ethan studied the map. The pins clustered in a rough arc across the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, one site just across the Northern California border. Not random. Too deliberately spaced to be coincidence. Too widespread to be a simple equipment failure. Someone's interfering with them, he said. No one at the table disagreed. Queen Muriel finally moved, joining him at the map. She was not a tall woman, but she had the quality of making every room feel organized around her without any apparent effort. We don't know who yet. The Guardian at the Pine Ridge site reported unusual residual energy 3 days before the fluctuations began. Not Fae, not entirely human. Something in between. A half-blood, possibly. Or someone using borrowed Fae tools without knowing how to use them properly, she paused. Either way, this requires investigation from within the human world. Someone who can move between both sides without raising attention. Ethan already knew where this was going. I'll go back, he said. I know you will. His grandmother looked at him carefully. You left something unfinished in Willow Creek. He didn't answer that. The meeting continued for another hour. Logistics, protocols, which Guardian teams would monitor which sites, how to communicate across the portal network without risking further interference. Ethan participated fully and kept his face professional throughout. He was good at that. He had been trained from childhood to manage the gap between what he was thinking and what he showed the room. But when the advisors finally filed out and he was left alone with the map and the silver pins, his mind went straight back to the festival, to the string lights, to Emma's face in the second after she'd said it. I was hoping it would be you. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose and breathed out slowly. He had lived in the human world for years on and off, passing through towns, staying long enough to monitor nearby portal sites, and then moving on before anyone asked too many questions. It was clean that way, uncomplicated. He was good at being a traveler, present enough to be useful, detached enough to leave without consequence. Willow Creek had not been like that. He wasn't sure exactly when it had changed. Maybe the afternoon Emma had spent 3 hours identifying a rare fungal infection in someone's kitchen garden and refused to charge them, because she said they were clearly struggling enough already. Maybe the evening she'd shown up to help a neighbor clear storm debris and stayed until after dark without once mentioning it, as if it were some kind of sacrifice. Maybe it was just all of it, accumulated slowly, the way water eventually shapes stone. He had told himself it didn't matter. He had told himself a lot of things. He left the council chamber before he could think about it any further. Back in Willow Creek, Emma woke up the next morning and lay very still in her bed for a while. She was a practical person by nature. She grew plants. She made things with her hands. She solved problems with the information available to her. Feelings were fine, but they required management the same way a garden did. You had to look at them clearly and decide what needed tending and what needed to be cut back before it spread somewhere it shouldn't. What she was feeling right now was somewhere between embarrassed and confused, with a thin layer of something that felt uncomfortably like hurt underneath. She'd said what she'd said. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But the way Ethan had left, that light in his pocket, that controlled voice, that one backward glance, none of it made sense. People didn't leave like that. Not unless there was something they weren't saying. She went downstairs and made tea and tried not to think about it. She was wiping down the counter when she saw the pendant on the kitchen table. She'd brought it home without really registering she'd done so, set it down among her keys and a stack of plant identification guides. It was small, a crescent moon carved from some pale material she couldn't identify. Not silver, not bone. Something that felt faintly warm even now, as if it retained heat. The carving was extraordinarily detailed for something so small, the surface etched with tiny symbols she didn't recognize. She turned it over in her fingers for a long moment. It looked handmade. It looked old. It looked like nothing she'd ever seen in any shop in Willow Creek or anywhere else. She set it gently on the windowsill above the sink, where the morning light hit it. It didn't glow exactly, but it caught the light in a way that made her stand there a moment longer than she needed to, looking at it. Then she put the kettle on again, because the tea had gone cold, and she had a full day of work ahead and exactly no time for things she couldn't explain. The call came in on a Tuesday. Emma was in the middle of repotting a batch of echinacea seedlings when her phone buzzed with a message from Dave Kowalski, one of the regular hikers who volunteered with the local trail maintenance crew. Dave was not a dramatic person. He used punctuation correctly and never sent more than 2 texts in a row. So when his message read, "Something's wrong with the plants up on the ridge trail. Not normal wrong. You should come see this." Emma put down her trowel and called him back immediately. "Define not normal," she said. "I've been hiking that trail for 11 years, Dave said. "I know what seasonal dieback looks like. I know what drought stress looks like. This isn't either of those things. The ferns are black, Emma. Not brown, not yellow. Black. And they went that way fast. My buddy hiked the same section 4 days ago, and everything was fine." She was in her truck within the hour. Pine Ridge National Forest sat about 40 minutes east of Willow Creek, climbing steadily into the Cascades through old-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar. Emma had spent a significant portion of her life in these woods, collecting specimens, learning from the older herbalists who'd taught her, just walking when she needed to think. She knew the forest the way you knew a place you loved, which meant she noticed immediately when something was off. It started subtly. A patch of sword ferns along the trailhead looking slightly dull, slightly flat. Easy to dismiss. But a quarter-mile up the ridge trail it became impossible to dismiss. A wide sweep of undergrowth that had simply collapsed, plants lying flat and blackened, as if something had burned through them without leaving any actual burn marks. No scorching on the soil. No smell of fire. Just vegetation that had given up entirely and turned the color of old ash. Emma crouched at the edge of it and didn't touch anything. The soil looked wrong too. Not dry, not waterlogged. Wrong in a way she didn't have a word for. The texture was off, almost crystalline at the surface, like the ground itself had been altered at a level she couldn't see. She took photos. She collected samples with gloved hands, careful and methodical. She expanded her search area and found 2 more patches further up the trail, each slightly larger than the last. She was kneeling beside the 3rd patch, making notes, when she heard footsteps on the trail behind her. She assumed it was Dave coming to check on her progress. It was not Dave. You got called in too, Ethan said. Emma stood up slowly. She turned around even more slowly, giving herself a moment she absolutely needed. He was standing about 10 feet away on the trail, wearing a dark jacket she hadn't seen before and carrying a worn leather satchel. He looked exactly the same as he always did, composed, slightly watchful, that quality he had of seeming entirely comfortable in outdoor spaces. Except that he also looked like a person who had been thinking hard about something for several days and hadn't resolved it. Good, she thought. Same. Nobody called me in, she said. I came because hikers reported unusual plant damage. What are you doing here? I heard the same reports. From who? You don't live here. A pause. I was in the area. She turned back to her notes because it was easier than looking at him. You left without saying anything. I know. I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen just because you're standing here. I'm not asking you to. His voice was quiet. Not defensive, careful. Like someone choosing words the way you choose footing on an unstable path. I owe you an explanation. I know that. I need a little more time before I can give you the right 1 inch. Emma wrote something in her notebook that she would later realize was completely illegible. Fine, she said. But right now I need to figure out what's happening to this forest, so if you're going to be here, be useful. He was. That was the frustrating thing. Within 20 minutes of working alongside her, it was clear he knew plants at a level that went beyond casual interest. He identified species she hadn't spotted, read the spread pattern of the damaged areas with a precision that felt almost practiced, and asked exactly the right questions. Not the questions of someone curious, but the questions of someone cross-referencing what they were seeing against something they already knew. These affected areas, he said, studying the edge of the third patch carefully. They follow a line. Do you see it? She looked. She hadn't noticed it before. The 3 patches weren't randomly placed. They formed a rough arc, curving gently northeast through the forest. What would cause a pattern like that, she asked. He was quiet for a moment in a way that felt like a decision rather than uncertainty. Energy displacement, he said finally. When something underground is disrupted, a water source, a geological feature, it can affect vegetation along the disruption line. It was a reasonable explanation. It wasn't, she was fairly certain, the complete one. They worked through the afternoon, mapping the full extent of the damage and cataloging everything Emma could collect for testing. The affected area was larger than Dave's initial message had suggested. Nearly 2 acres of understory vegetation showing some degree of impact, with 3 concentrated patches showing severe collapse. At one point they rounded a curve in the trail and found a 4th patch, this one still in progress. Plants at the edges still green, the center already blackened, the change visibly moving outward like a slow exhale. Emma stared at it. That's not any natural process I've ever seen. No, Ethan said. It's not. She looked at him sharply. Ethan. I know. That answer you owe me. He met her eyes then, and she saw something in them she hadn't expected. Not evasion, but something more like the weight of a thing that had been kept in one place too long and was ready to shift. There's more going on here than damaged plants, he said. A lot more. And I promise I'll explain everything. All of it. But not here on a trail in the middle of the afternoon. He glanced around the forest, a quick, scanning look that she filed away. Can you give me until tonight? We're going to need to stay near the area to do this properly, and I'd rather explain where we can talk without interruption. Tonight, she repeated. Please. Emma looked at the blackened plants spreading silently outward in front of her and thought about the crystalline soil and the carved pendant on her windowsill and the silver light that had pulsed from his pocket at the festival. She thought about the fact that in 11 years, Dave had never seen anything like this. She thought about the fact that Ethan had shown up in this specific forest on this specific afternoon and had not seemed even slightly surprised by what they'd found. Tonight, she said again, and this time it wasn't a question. The campground sat at the edge of a mountain lake that didn't appear on most tourist maps. Emma had known about it for years. One of those places passed along by word of mouth among people who actually spent time in the forest rather than just driving through it. No hookups, no facilities beyond a fire ring and a flat stretch of cleared ground. Nothing between you and the tree line except a few feet of pine needles. The lake caught whatever light was available and held it perfectly still, like a mirror laid flat on the ground. She set up her small tent while Ethan built the fire. Neither of them talked much. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it had weight. The specific weight of a conversation that both people know is coming and neither is quite ready to start. Emma made instant coffee on her camp stove because she'd learned long ago that difficult conversations went better with something warm to hold. She handed Ethan a cup without asking if he wanted one and sat down on the log across the fire ring from him. "Okay," she said. "Talk." He held the cup in both hands and looked at the fire for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I'm not human," he said. The lake was very quiet. "All right," Emma said. He blinked. "That's it. I'm waiting for the rest." He studied her face like he was checking for something. Fear, maybe, or disbelief. She kept her expression even and waited. Because she was a practical person, and she had learned that the fastest way to get to the truth of something was to stay still and let it arrive. He told her everything. The Fey realm. Silver Hollow. Hidden in the mountains, she'd looked at her entire life without knowing what was inside them. The portal network that connected both worlds at carefully maintained crossing points. His grandmother, the current queen, who had sent him to monitor the human-adjacent territories years ago. The way Fey aged differently, moved differently, perceived the world with senses that layered over the human ones like a transparency laid over a map. He told her about the months in Willow Creek, that he'd chosen it for proximity to two portal sites and stayed because the town was easy to move through without drawing attention. He explained the glowing message at the festival. He described Silver Hollow in enough detail that she understood he wasn't making it up as he went. There was too much texture in it, too many small specific things that a person inventing a story wouldn't bother to include. When he finished, the fire had burned down to a steadier, quieter burn. Emma drank the last of her coffee. "How long have you been coming to Willow Creek?" 8 months. "And the whole time you knew, and you just didn't say anything." "I couldn't." Revealing Fey existence to humans without authorization from the court is. "I understand that part." Her voice wasn't raised. That was the thing that seemed to catch him off guard more than anything else. She wasn't frightened or incredulous. She was just precise. "I'm not angry about the secret itself, Ethan. I understand rules exist. What I'm telling you is that you spent 8 months talking to me almost every day, and at some point," she paused, chose her words carefully. "At some point it stopped being about rules and started being about trust. And you made a choice about that." He didn't argue. That was the moment she decided she could probably forgive him eventually. Not because he apologized, but because he didn't try to explain it away. He just sat with what she'd said and let it be true. "You're right," he said. "I know. I didn't know how to start that conversation. And the longer I waited, the harder it got." "Yes, that is generally how that works." Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, but close. "You're not scared." "Should I be?" "Most people." "I'm not most people." She set her cup down. "I've also been looking at that pendant for 4 days and running out of rational explanations for what it's made of. I think some part of me already knew something wasn't adding up." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small, smooth stone, flat, dark gray, etched with the same symbols as the pendant. He held it out across the fire toward her. She took it. It was warm, the same inexplicable warmth as the moon carving, like it had been sitting in sunlight, even though it hadn't. "A translation stone," he said. "It doesn't work perfectly, but it helps bridge Fey script to English. The symbols on the pendant say something close to, where one world ends, another begins." She looked at the stone in her palm. Then she set it carefully on the log beside her. "The forest," she said. "This is connected to what you were telling me about the portal network." "Yes. The damage we're seeing, the plant collapse, the soil alteration. It's consistent with what happens when a portal stabilizer starts failing. Magical energy leaks into the surrounding area, and the natural environment absorbs it until it can't anymore." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. 7 sites across the Pacific Northwest are showing the same pattern. It's not equipment failure. Someone is interfering with the stabilizers deliberately. Who? We don't know yet. The energy signature at Pine Ridge doesn't match any known phase source. Something in between. That's the phrase my grandmother's counselor used. Emma turned this over. "What happens if the stabilizers fail completely?" "The portals destabilize. Energy bleeds into the human world in waves. Not dangerous to people directly, but the environmental impact would be significant. Ecosystems disrupted, unusual phenomena that humans wouldn't be able to explain, he paused. And it would expose the Fey realm in ways we've spent centuries avoiding. So we need to find out who's doing this and stop them before it gets to that point. That's the goal, yes. Right? She stood up and brushed pine needles off her jacket. Then we should sleep because we've been on our feet for 6 hours and you can't investigate anything properly when you're tired. Even Faye, I'm guessing. He looked up at her. Emma. She stopped. The festival, he said quietly. What you said. I want you to know that he stopped. Tried again. I didn't leave because of what you said. I want to be clear about that. The fire snapped softly between them. I know, she said. And she did know. That was the part that made it both easier and harder than it should have been. We'll figure the rest out as we go. She went to her tent. It took her longer than usual to fall asleep, but she did eventually, listening to the lake settle against its banks in the dark, calm and patient, and entirely unchanged by anything either of them had said. The road out of Pine Ridge the next morning was quiet and gray, fog sitting low in the valleys the way it did in early October, the mountains appearing and disappearing behind it like something that couldn't quite make up its mind. Emma drove. She'd made that clear before they'd even finished breaking camp. It was her truck, she knew these roads, and she needed something to do with her hands while she was still processing the fact that the person in her passenger seat was a Fey prince who had spent 8 months helping her restock herbal tinctures and acting like the most normal person in Willow Creek. Ethan had pulled out a hand-drawn map from his leather satchel, actual paper, marked in Fey script with small notations that he translated aloud as they went. 7 sites. They needed to visit each one, assess the damage, and find whatever physical evidence might point toward who was interfering with the stabilizers. His grandmother's team would handle the restoration work later. Right now, they needed information. Start with the coast? Emma said. The coastal site is one of the 2 critical ones. If we start there, we can work our way back inland and have a clearer picture of the pattern by the time we reach the northern sites. She merged onto the highway heading west. How long have these portals existed? The ones in this region? About 400 years. They were established when Fey Scouts first mapped the Pacific Northwest thoroughly, he paused. Before that there were older, rougher crossings, less stable, less intentional. More like gaps than doors. And humans never noticed? Humans noticed plenty of things they couldn't explain. They just explained them differently. He said it without any particular superiority. Just as a fact, the way you describe weather. The stories were already here. The mythology. Humans were never as unaware as the court liked to believe. Emma thought about that for the next several miles. The Oregon coast arrived the way it always did, suddenly, after a long stretch of forest, the trees opening up and the Pacific sitting there enormous and gray-green, and completely indifferent to anything happening on land. Emma had always loved that about the ocean. It had no interest in human problems whatsoever. The portal site was not on the beach itself, but in a narrow coastal canyon about a mile inland, where a creek ran through basalt formations draped in sea moss and fern. Beautiful under normal circumstances. Currently, the vegetation along the canyon walls showed the same blackened collapse as Pine Ridge, and the creek water ran with a faint iridescent shimmer that Emma was fairly certain wasn't natural. Ethan found the stabilizer within minutes, a flat stone marker set into the canyon wall, inscribed with face symbols, completely invisible to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. He pressed his hand against it and was quiet for a moment. Damaged, he said. Not randomly. The core inscription has been partially rewritten. Rewritten how? Someone altered the anchor sequence. It's like, he considered, like changing a single load-bearing word in a set of instructions. Everything still runs, but it runs wrong, and eventually it fails. He examined the edges of the marker carefully. This took knowledge. Whoever did this understood Fey inscription work well enough to modify it without triggering an immediate alarm. Emma photographed everything while Ethan made careful notations. They spent 2 hours at the canyon before moving on. The next 4 days settled into a rhythm that Emma hadn't expected to find comfortable as quickly as she did. They drove. They investigated. They camped when the sites were too remote for reasonable day trips and stayed in small roadside motels when they weren't. The kind with wood-paneled walls and ice machines in the hallway and breakfast that consisted entirely of packaged pastries. Ethan seemed genuinely fascinated by packaged pastries, which Emma found disproportionately endearing. They visited old-growth redwood groves in the southern Oregon hills where the portal site was set into the root system of a tree so large it had its own microclimate. They climbed to a mountain meadow in the Cascades where the stabilizer was hidden inside a rock cairn that hikers had been adding stones to for decades without any idea what was underneath. They drove the Columbia River Gorge in the rain and found a site tucked behind a waterfall, the marker half submerged and badly damaged, the surrounding area showing the most severe environmental impact they'd seen yet. At each location, the same evidence. Deliberate modification. The same unfamiliar energy signature. A pattern that was becoming clearer and more troubling with every site they documented. At the Redwood site, they were met by a Fae guardian named Sable. Emma had been prepared, intellectually, for the possibility of meeting other Fae. She had not been fully prepared for Sable, who was approximately 5 feet tall, wore a park ranger jacket with no apparent irony, and had the kind of sharp, watchful energy of someone who had been protecting these trees for a very long time and took it personally. Sable looked at Emma the way you might look at an unexpected variable in an equation, not unfriendly, just assessing. She knows everything? Sable asked Ethan. Yes. Court authorization. In process. She's helping with the investigation. Sable looked at Emma again. You're the herbalist. Yes. Ethan said you identified the soil alteration at Pine Ridge immediately. The texture was wrong. Once you know what healthy forest soil is supposed to feel like, the difference was obvious. Something shifted in Sable's expression, not warmth exactly, but the beginning of professional respect, which Emma suspected was the more meaningful of the two where Sable was concerned. The Guardian spent an hour with them at the site, sharing observations from the past 2 weeks, and producing a small journal filled with notes in Fae script that Ethan translated in real time. In the evenings, when the work was done and they'd eaten whatever was available and the day had finally gone quiet, they talked. Not about the investigation. About other things. The way Ethan had learned to cook by spending time in human kitchens because Fae cuisine was elaborate and seasonal and completely impractical for traveling. The plants Emma had nearly killed before she understood them. The parts of human life that Ethan found genuinely puzzling versus the parts he'd come to love. He said he loved October specifically, the quality of the light, the way humans marked the seasonal turn with deliberate celebration, the feeling of something being honored. Emma told him about the years she'd spent trying to figure out whether to leave Willow Creek for somewhere larger, somewhere with more opportunity, and how she'd eventually realized that the work she wanted to do was exactly the work she was already doing. In exactly the place she was already doing it. You're not someone who needs to be somewhere else to be yourself, Ethan said. No, she agreed. I figured that out eventually. He was quiet for a moment after that, looking at whatever small fire or lamp was between them, and Emma had the distinct impression he was thinking about something adjacent to that idea. Something about his own life and where he was supposed to be, but he didn't say it, and she didn't push. They had time, or they thought they did. On the 6th day of traveling, Ethan's jacket pocket lit up again, steadier this time, more insistent, and when he checked the message his expression shifted in a way that made Emma set down what she was holding. What, she said. The northern site, he said. Washington State. The Guardian there stopped reporting 2 days ago. Emma was already reaching for the truck keys. The northern Washington site yielded nothing. No Guardian. No signs of struggle or sudden departure. Just an empty monitoring post tucked inside a hollow between 2 granite outcroppings, a cold fire ring, and a stabilizer marker that had been so thoroughly altered it was barely functioning. The surrounding forest was silent in the particular way that suggested the animals had decided collectively to be somewhere else. Ethan stood at the marker for a long time with his hand pressed against it, reading whatever information passed through the stone. And when he finally stepped back, his face had the controlled neutrality Emma had learned to recognize as him working hard not to show concern. The Guardian's name is Wren, he said. She's been stationed here for 6 years. Would she have left voluntarily? Not without reporting in. Not Wren. He looked at the altered marker carefully. Whoever did this was here recently, within the last 3 days. And this modification is different from the others, more complete, more confident, like they've been practicing. Emma photographed the site and collected soil samples while Ethan contacted Silver Hollow through a small communication stone, flat and translucent, producing no visible light this time, just a faint vibration in his palm. He spoke in a language Emma couldn't follow, low and rapid, with the compressed efficiency of someone delivering an urgent report. When he finished, he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not alarm, something more deliberate than that. "My grandmother wants us to come to Silver Hollow," he said. "Into the Fey realm." "Yes. There are historical records in the Grand Library that may explain the energy signature we've been tracking. Records that don't exist in any human archive," he paused. "She's issuing formal authorization for your entry. That's not a simple thing. She's never done it for a human before." Emma thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. "When do we leave?" The portal was in the mountain wall behind the monitoring post, invisible until Ethan pressed his palm flat against a specific section of granite and spoke 3 words in the old language. Then it was simply there, an opening where solid rock had been, framing a passage that led somewhere the light was different. Warmer, more silver-toned, as if the air itself was slightly luminescent. Emma walked through without hesitating, because hesitating would not have made it less real, and she was not in the habit of stalling on things that needed to be done. Silver Hollow was not what she'd expected, which she recognized was a foolish thing to think since she hadn't known what to expect. She'd imagined something ancient and moss-covered, ruins and grandeur, the kind of beauty that looks like it's been forgotten. What she found instead was a city that felt genuinely inhabited, full of the small evidence of daily life, of things being made and maintained and argued over and enjoyed. The buildings were beautiful in the way that things built carefully over centuries become beautiful, acquiring a kind of earned quality that has nothing to do with decoration. The people, the Fae, looked at her without hostility but with the particular alertness of a community that did not often receive visitors from the other side of the wall. Several nodded to Ethan with the familiarity of people who had known him a long time. One elderly Fae man stopped him briefly to ask a question Emma couldn't understand, glanced at her with what seemed like genuine curiosity, and then moved on without drama. Ethan's grandmother met them at the entrance to the Grand Library. Queen Muriel was smaller than Emma had expected from the way Ethan spoke about her. Not physically diminished, but compact, self-contained, the kind of person who had learned long ago that power doesn't require size. She wore no crown or formal regalia, just a deep gray robe that looked practical rather than ceremonial. Her eyes were the same quality as Ethan's, too bright, too still, but where his were watchful, hers were simply comprehensive, the eyes of someone who had been reading situations accurately for a very long time. She looked at Emma for a moment. "You're calmer than I expected," she said. "I've had a week to adjust," Emma said. Something at the corner of Muriel's mouth moved. "Come inside. We have a great deal to find." The Grand Library was where Silver Hollow kept everything it couldn't afford to lose. It occupied the entirety of the Valen Tower's lower levels, a series of interconnected chambers cut directly into the mountain, the walls lined with shelves that had been fitted so precisely into the stone they looked grown rather than built. The collection was organized in a system Emma couldn't immediately decode. Not alphabetical, not chronological, something more like a web of relationships between subjects, each document cross-referenced to others through small attached tags in Fey script. Counselor Davin assigned them a research space and produced 3 archivists who knew the collection well enough to find things without searching. Within an hour, the table in front of Emma and Ethan was covered in documents, some on materials she didn't recognize, some on very old paper, a few on thin flat stones etched with precise script. What they found, reading and translating through the afternoon, was a history Emma had never imagined existed. 300 years ago, Fae and humans in the Pacific Northwest had not been strangers. Not openly. The Fae realm had always been hidden, but there had been deliberate, managed contact between Fae guardians and specific human communities. Herbalists, primarily. People who worked with the land closely enough to notice the Fae presence and could be trusted with limited knowledge of it. The arrangement had been mutual. Humans who understood the portal network helped maintain the surrounding environments, and Fae guardians provided knowledge of plant and soil systems that no human scientist had access to. Emma sat back and looked at Ethan. "My grandmother's grandmother," she said slowly. "She was from Willow Creek. She was a herbalist. She used to talk about. She called them the mountain people. My mother thought it was folk stories." Ethan was very still. What did she say about them? That they kept the forest healthy. That there were people who lived inside the mountains and came out sometimes to help when something went wrong with the land. Emma looked back at the documents in front of her. She wasn't making it up. No, he said quietly. She wasn't. The disruption, the records explained, had begun with a disagreement. Not a war, nothing dramatic, but a slow accumulation of fear and misunderstanding on both sides until the managed contact simply stopped. The Guardians withdrew. The human communities forgot, or told the stories differently. The portal network continued functioning because it had been built to function without intervention, but the relationship that had maintained it organically for generations simply disappeared. And now someone was exploiting exactly that gap. The energy signature they'd been tracking appeared in one set of records, a brief account from a Fey scholar 2 centuries ago, describing an experiment in channeling portal energy through non-Fey instruments. Crude early attempts to harness what the stabilizers produced without understanding how to contain it. The scholar's name in the record had been partially obscured, but the notation beside it was clear enough. Student of both worlds. Never fully trusted by either. Emma stared at that line for a long time. Someone who grew up between the Fey and human worlds, she said. Someone who knows enough about Fey inscription to modify the stabilizers, but whose energy signature reads as neither one nor the other. A person who feels they belong to both realms, Ethan said slowly, and was never accepted by either. They looked at each other across the table covered in 300 years of carefully kept history. We need to find them, Emma said, before they take down another site. Silver Hollow did not pause its celebrations for a crisis. This was something Ethan had tried to explain to Emma on the walk from the library to the central plaza, and she had listened with the focused attention she gave everything. But he could tell the reality of it only landed when they turned the corner, and the Festival of Moons was simply there, fully assembled, entirely alive, completely indifferent to the investigation consuming the upper levels of the Valen Tower. The plaza had been transformed. Lanterns hung at every height, not the string lights of Willow Creek's Harvest Festival, but something older and more deliberate, spheres of captured light in deep amber and silver blue, drifting slowly at the ends of long threads as if breathing. The stone plaza floor had been covered with woven mats and low tables, and Fae of every age moved between them with the ease of people who had been doing this for generations. There was music, layered and unhurried. Instruments Emma didn't recognize producing sounds that seemed to come from slightly inside the ear rather than outside it. Queen Myrrel had been firm on the point. The Festival of Moons happened every year at the same time regardless of circumstances, because the Fey relationship with seasonal cycles was not decorative. It was structural. Missing it would have been like deciding not to breathe for an afternoon because you were busy. Ethan had learned long ago not to argue with his grandmother about this particular subject. Is it always like this? Emma asked, standing at the plaza edge taking it in. More or less. The music changes. The lantern colors shift depending on the year's character. He watched her face, the way she looked at things carefully before deciding how to feel about them, processing rather than reacting. What do you think? I think it's beautiful, she said simply. And I think you should have brought me here under better circumstances. He didn't have a good answer for that, so he didn't offer one. Myrrel had insisted they attend the first part of the evening. The library would still be there later, she'd said. The documents would not rearrange themselves. And Emma had been inside Silver Hollow for 6 hours and had earned the right to see something other than archive materials and worried counselors. So they stayed. They found a table near the edge of the plaza where they could see the full sweep of the celebration without being directly in the center of it. A Fey woman Emma hadn't met brought food, small dishes of things that didn't map exactly onto any cuisine Emma knew, though the flavors were recognizable in the way that variations on a theme are recognizable. She ate without asking for explanations, which Ethan noticed and appreciated. Around them, Fae who had heard about the visiting human came by in ones and twos, not intrusively, but with the genuine interest of a community that had not had this kind of contact in a very long time. An older Fey gardener named Ashen sat with them for 20 minutes comparing notes with Emma on soil composition and seasonal planting in a conversation that required almost no translation because the subject matter simply crossed whatever boundary existed between their worlds. A young archivist named Finn asked Emma 3 rapid questions about human record-keeping systems, and then apologized for the questions, and then asked 2 more. Emma handled all of it with a naturalness that made Ethan's chest do something complicated. Later, when the crowd had thickened around the central performance area, and they had a pocket of relative quiet at their table, Ethan refilled Emma's cup from the ceramic pitcher between them and said, without planning to say it, "I never stopped thinking about what you said at the festival." Emma set her cup down carefully. "Which part?" "You know which part." She did know. He watched her decide not to pretend otherwise. "I wasn't planning to say it," she said. "It just came out." "I know. That's partly why it." He stopped. "I've spent a long time being careful about what I say and don't say. In both worlds. It comes with the position, and it comes with living between 2 places at once. You learn to measure everything." He looked at his cup. "You didn't measure it. You just said it." It seemed like the accurate thing to say. It was. He looked at her then. "I told you that whoever married you would be lucky. I said it because I was standing there watching you spend an entire evening giving your time and care to everyone around you and thinking." He caught himself. "I was thinking that I was the one who was lucky. For knowing you. For all of it." Emma was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone uncertain what to say, but the quiet of someone taking something improperly before responding. "That's a much better answer than running away," she said. "I didn't run away. Your pocket lit up and you left in 30 seconds. That's technically true." "Ethan." "Yes. I know what I said and I meant it. And I understand now why you left." She turned her cup in her hands, the same way she'd turned the translation stone at the lake. A thinking gesture. "What I don't know is what comes after that. You live in 2 worlds. I live in one town in Oregon. Those are not obviously compatible things." "No," he said. "They're not obviously compatible. So what are you actually saying?" He opened his mouth. His jacket pocket lit up. This time it wasn't the soft pulse of a routine message. It was continuous, bright, and urgent, accompanied by the faint harmonic tone that in the Fey communication system meant, "Stop what you were doing immediately." Around the plaza, several other Fey felt it too. Heads turning, conversations pausing, that particular collective stillness of a community that had just registered something wrong. Ethan was already on his feet. Emma was half a second behind him. Counselor Davin appeared from the direction of the Valen Tower, moving faster than her usual measured pace, which told Ethan everything before she said a word. 3 sites simultaneously, Davin said. Pine Ridge, the Columbia Gorge site, and the Coastal Canyon. All 3 have gone critical in the last 20 minutes. Simultaneously, Ethan repeated. Not sequentially. No. All 3 at once. Davin's voice was very controlled. Whoever is doing this escalated. This wasn't a probe or a test. This was a demonstration. Emma had her notebook out. A demonstration of what? That they can trigger multiple failures at the same time, Ethan said. Which means they're not working through the sites one by one anymore. They have access to a trigger mechanism, something that can reach multiple stabilizers at once. Can that be done? Emma asked. Ethan looked at Davin. Davin looked at Ethan. It shouldn't be possible, Davin said. Not without access to the Master Anchor Registry. That registry exists in exactly one place. Emma followed their eyes up toward the Valen Tower, toward the library levels where they'd spent the afternoon. Someone was in the archive, she said. Before us, Ethan said grimly. They already knew what we spent today trying to find out. They're not behind us in this investigation. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. They're ahead of us. The lantern swayed gently above the empty table, amber and silver blue, as the festival of moons continued around them with the patient indifference of something that had been happening long before any of this and fully intended to keep happening long after. They worked through the night, not metaphorically, literally through it, the hours between midnight and dawn becoming a kind of compressed urgency that had no room for anything except the next task and the one after that. Ethan coordinated from Silver Hollow's communication center, while Emma sat beside him with her notebook and the translated archive documents, cross-referencing stabilizer repair sequences against the damage profiles they documented at each site. By 3 in the morning, they had a working theory about the trigger mechanism. By 4, they had a repair sequence that might actually function. By 5, when the first pale suggestion of light appeared above the mountain peaks visible through the tower windows, they had a plan. It was not a comfortable plan. The 3 critical sites needed simultaneous stabilization, the same way they'd been simultaneously destabilized. A single repair team moving sequentially would be too slow. The magical energy already bleeding through the compromised portals would reach irreversible threshold levels before any sequential effort could complete. They needed 3 teams working in parallel, each team requiring at least one person who understood the physical environment well enough to manage the natural side effects, the plant collapse, the soil disruption, the water contamination, while the Fae members handled the inscription work. Ethan looked at Emma across the communication center table. "I need to ask you something." "The coastal canyon," she said before he finished. "You need me at the coastal canyon because it's the worst affected, and I've already been there, and I know the terrain. I was going to ask if you were willing." "I'm willing." She was already organizing her field notes. "Who else is on that team?" "Sable. And 2 inscription specialists from the court." He paused. "I'll be coordinating between all 3 sites. I won't be with you directly." She looked up from her notes. Something passed between them. Not quite concern, not quite reassurance. Something more honest than either. "I'll be fine," she said. "Go coordinate." The coastal canyon in the early morning was a different place from the one they'd visited days earlier. The iridescent shimmer in the creek water had intensified overnight, spreading further downstream, and the blackened vegetation on the canyon walls had progressed another 10 feet in each direction from the stabilizer marker. The air had a particular quality, not unpleasant exactly, but dense, like being inside a held note. Emma's skin registered it before her mind did, a faint persistent hum that she felt more in her sternum than heard with her ears. Sable was already there when Emma arrived, the small guardian moving along the canyon wall with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for decades because she had been. "Good," Sable said, without looking up from her examination of the marker. "You brought the soil amendments." Emma set down her pack and opened it. She'd spent the last hour before leaving Silver Hollow preparing a compound based on what she'd found in the Fae archive and what she knew from her own practice. A combination of activated biochar, specific mineral compounds, and 3 plant-derived elements that the archive records suggested had been used historically to help natural environments reabsorb excess magical energy. It was the best translation she could manage between Fae ecological knowledge and her own training. Whether it would work at this scale, under these conditions, she wouldn't know until she tried. "Walk me through the sequence," she said to Sable. "What happens when your team begins the inscription repair, and what does the surrounding environment do in response?" Sable explained quickly and precisely, the kind of briefing that assumed competence and didn't repeat itself. As the inscription work began, portal energy that had been leaking outward would temporarily spike before it stabilized, a brief intensification before the containment reasserted itself. During that spike, the surrounding soil and plant life would absorb a concentrated pulse. Without intervention, that pulse would cause significant additional damage. With Emma's compounds applied in the right sequence to the right areas, there was a chance the natural environment could process the energy rather than being overwhelmed by it. "A chance," Emma said. "A good one," Sable said. "Better than without you here." The 2 Fae inscription specialists began their work at the stabilizer marker. Careful, focused, speaking the repair sequences in low voices with the concentration of surgeons. Sable moved to assist them. Emma spread out across the canyon floor and began. She worked methodically, the way she always worked, starting at the outermost edges of the affected area and moving inward, applying the compound in careful measured amounts, reading the soil response with her hands as she went. It was not so different from the most demanding work she did in her practice, the interventions on seriously compromised land that required patience and attention and the willingness to adjust based on what the ground itself was telling you. She was halfway through the central section when the spike hit. It came without warning, a pressure change, a sudden intensification of the hum in her sternum, and then the shimmer in the creek water flared white for a few seconds. Emma kept working. She'd been warned. She pressed both hands flat against the ground at the point she'd identified as highest concentration and held the compound steady and breathed slowly and waited for the environment to do what it knew how to do when given what it needed. The soil absorbed it. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but steadily, over about 4 minutes. The white light faded back to shimmer, and the shimmer began, for the first time since she'd seen this place, to dim. She sat back on her heels and let herself exhale. Sable was beside her. "The marker is holding," the guardian said. There was something in her voice that Emma hadn't heard before, something warmer than professional respect. "The anchor is stable." Emma's phone showed 3 messages from Ethan. The first 2 were status updates. The Pine Ridge team had completed their repair. The gorge site was 70% through theirs. The third message was just, "Coastal." She typed back, "Stable." His response took about 15 seconds. Then, all 3 holding. "Come back when you can." She stood up, brushing canyon soil from her knees, and looked at the creek. The shimmer was almost gone. In the walls of the canyon, the blackened ferns were not recovering. That would take time, seasons probably, but they had stopped advancing. The collapse had halted at its current edge, and already at the furthest margins, where Emma had applied the compound first, the soil looked different. Less crystalline, more like itself. It was a beginning. The days that followed were the hardest work Emma had done. From the coastal canyon, they moved to the remaining sites, the northern Washington location, the mountain meadow, the redwood grove, and repeated the process at each one. The Guardian teams had been fully mobilized now, Fae specialists arriving from Silver Hollow through the portals with equipment and repair materials, coordinating with Emma and with each other with a fluency that surprised her. They had expected to work alongside a human with patience and explanation. They had not expected someone who read the land the way she did, who absorbed the Fae ecological knowledge from the archive documents and applied it without the gap of unfamiliarity. Word moved through the Guardian community faster than it moved through any formal channel. By the time they reached the final site, the teams were consulting Emma as a matter of course rather than courtesy. They found Wren on the 4th day. The missing Guardian from the northern Washington site had not been harmed. She had been contained. Whoever had altered the stabilizers had used a binding technique, Fae in origin but crudely applied, locking Wren in a suspension state inside a secondary chamber of the monitoring post that Emma and Ethan had missed on their first visit. Sable found the chamber by feel rather than sight, pressing her hands along the rock wall until she felt the hollow behind it. Wren, once released, was furious in the specific way of someone who has been inconvenienced rather than frightened. Her first words were a rapid assessment of the stabilizer damage. Her second words were a physical description of the person who had bound her. Young, slight, eyes that caught light the same way Fae eyes did, but not quite right, like a photograph of the thing rather than the thing itself. Moved with confidence through the Fae inscription work, but hesitated at the natural environmental elements, the parts that required reading the land rather than reading text. They knew the theory, Wren said, but they'd only ever learned from documents. They didn't have anyone to teach them the practical side. Emma looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the ground for a moment, and when he looked up his expression had the careful quality of someone who had just understood something difficult. They were self-taught, he said, from the archive documents, which means they had access to Silver Hollow's library at some point, probably years ago. They learned everything they could from the records and then left, and they've been working alone ever since. A person of both worlds, Emma said quietly, who never belonged to either. The last stabilizer sealed with a sound like a door closing gently. Not dramatic, not final, just settled. The magical energy stopped bleeding into the surrounding forest. The trees around them, old growth and enormous, stood in their ordinary silence. The network was whole. Willow Creek looked exactly the same. That was the first thing Emma noticed when she drove back into town on a Thursday evening 30 days after the Harvest Festival. The way it had simply continued being itself, while everything else had changed. The same storefronts, the same cracked sidewalk outside the hardware store that nobody had gotten around to fixing for 3 years, the same reliable smell of wood smoke from the bakery on the corner that burned through its supply faster than any establishment reasonably should. She'd been gone for most of a month. She had walked through a portal into a hidden Fae city, repaired a centuries-old magical network, and discovered that her grandmother's stories about mountain people were documented historical fact. She had come back to a town that had not noticed she was away long enough to ask questions, because she'd told people she was doing extended field work in the forest, and Willow Creek was the kind of place that accepted that kind of answer without requiring elaboration. She parked the truck and sat in it for a moment with the engine off. The moon was up already, early and bright, hanging above the Cascades with the particular clarity of October nights when the air had finally committed to being cold. She looked at it for a while. Then she went inside and made tea and stood at the kitchen window looking at the pendant on the windowsill, which had been sitting there gathering the light of a world it partly belonged to for 30 days. She was still standing there when her phone buzzed. Overlook. 20 minutes. If you're not too tired. She put on her jacket. The Overlook was a cleared point on the hill at the eastern edge of town. Not official, not maintained, just a spot where the tree line opened, and you could see the full sweep of the valley below and the mountains above it. And on clear nights like this the lights of Willow Creek arranged themselves into something that looked almost deliberate, as if the town had been placed there rather than grown. Ethan was already there when she arrived, standing at the edge of the clearing with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking out at the valley. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the dry grass. He looked different from when she'd first met him. Not physically. He was the same in every visible way. But there was something less managed about him now. Less of the careful layering she understood in retrospect had been his constant maintenance of a version of himself that didn't give too much away. Whatever that cost him had apparently gotten heavier than it was worth somewhere in the past 30 days. She stood beside him and looked out at the lights. "How's Ren?" she asked. Recovered and aggressively competent about it. She filed a full incident report before she'd been out of the binding suspension for 12 hours, a pause. "She also mentioned you specifically in the report. Apparently your work at the Canyon site is going to be referenced in Guardian training materials." "That's flattering." Sable used the word exceptional. "I've known Sable for 40 years. I've never heard her use that word about anyone." Emma looked at the valley. Did they find the person who did it? The question had been sitting between them since Ren's description. They'd discussed it in the field, the self-taught practitioner of both worlds, working alone from documents, never taught the practical elements that required a living teacher. Someone who had access to Silver Hollow's archive years ago and had then lost that access, or left, or been asked to leave. "Yes," Ethan said. "A young man named Kale. His mother was Fae, his father was human. He grew up between both communities and was never formally recognized by either. He taught himself from archive records he'd accessed as a child and spent years trying to force both worlds to acknowledge the connection that had been deliberately forgotten. By destabilizing the portals, he didn't want to destroy them. He wanted to make the damage visible enough that both sides would have to respond, have to cooperate. And in doing so, remember that they'd cooperated before." Ethan was quiet for a moment. His method was destructive, and he put both worlds at risk. "That's real, and the court is taking it seriously." But the thing he was pointing at wasn't wrong, Emma said. No, it wasn't. She thought about the archive documents. 300 years of managed contact, then fear and misunderstanding, and a slow withdrawal into separate silences. A history that a young man had tried to crack open with his hands because he'd grown up in the gap it left. What happens to him? The court is still deciding. My grandmother is. She's not unsympathetic. The method caused real harm, and that has to be addressed. But the underlying situation that produced him is something Silver Hollow has to reckon with, and she knows it. He paused. The cooperation that happened during the portal restoration, the Guardians working with you, the archive being used by a human for the first time in centuries, that's being discussed. Formally, as a potential model. Emma turned to look at him. That's significant. It's the beginning of something significant, which is different and slower, but it's real. He met her eyes. You're part of why it's being taken seriously. The Fae who worked alongside you in the field, what they saw you do, the way you worked with the land, that carried weight in ways I couldn't have predicted. She looked back at the valley. The lights of Willow Creek sat quiet and warm in the dark below them, the mountain behind it enormous and silver-edged in the moonlight. "Can I tell you something?" Ethan said. "You usually do eventually. At the Harvest Festival, when I said whoever marries you will be lucky," he stopped. "Started differently. I wasn't making an observation about you. I was talking about myself. What I meant was that I would be lucky. I just didn't have the nerve to say it that way." Emma was quiet. "I've spent a long time being careful," he said. "About both worlds. About what I let myself want in either of them. It's efficient, and it keeps things simple, and I've convinced myself for years that simple is the same as good." He turned to face her properly now. "It isn't. I know that now. And I know that what I want is not simple. It's complicated, and it crosses two worlds, and there are real obstacles to it that I can't dismiss. But I'd rather work through the complicated version than keep the simple 1 inch. Emma looked at him for a long moment. You know what I said at the festival? She said. I know. And you know I don't say things I don't mean. I know that too. Then you already have your answer. She turned back to the valley. What you're describing, the two worlds, the complications, working it out as you go, that's not a problem for me. I'm a herbalist. I work with complicated systems that take time and patience. I'm not looking for simple, she paused. I am, however, going to need you to stop disappearing without explanation. That's the one condition. He almost smiled. That's a reasonable condition. It's a very reasonable condition. Emma. She looked at him. I'm not leaving, he said. And it was so direct, so unmanaged, so completely without the layered carefulness she'd spent months navigating around, that it landed exactly the way it was meant to. Not as a promise about the future, which neither of them could guarantee. As a statement of fact about right now, tonight, in this clearing above the town where the lights were warm and the mountains were silver, and the moon was doing exactly what it had always done. She reached out and took his hand. Warm. The same inexplicable warmth as the pendant, as the translation stone, as all the small objects that had been trying to tell her something for weeks about where she was standing and who she was standing next to. Below them, Willow Creek was beginning to gather for the community celebration, the lights increasing, music starting up from somewhere near the square, the sound of it carrying up the hill in fragments. The restoration of the forest would be marked tonight, and the town would celebrate without fully knowing what it was celebrating, which was exactly how it should be for now. Above them, the Cascade Mountains stood in their ordinary darkness, and somewhere inside them, the city of Silver Hollow was lit with amber and silver light, and the portals between both worlds were stable and whole and breathing steadily. Emma did not let go of his hand. Neither did he. End.